What it is, what it was, and what it shall be. We're back again. Today's video is called Spirit War Boot Camp number 72, and this is entitled Babylon Time Loop Simulation. So, what is that about? So, a lot of people know about Babylon. Um, Even though Babylon is the basic heir to the Sumerian Empire, a lot of people associate Babylon and the myth, or rather, sort of mythic version of the Tower of Babel, to be the start of our modern era of history, and there's quite a bit to that. So we're gonna, and so what if the idea is that time is a loop, right? And so all these people like Kurzweil and all these transhumanists, and they're talking about this technological singularity. What if that's real? And what if there is what I've been referring to in the past as a temporal asymptote, which means there's point or points on the timeline where the time barrier is breached. And so information and potentially matter and energy can be transferred out of our linear temporal continuum into non-time. And so if that occurs, if this sort of time barrier is broken, it would mean that information, energy, and potentially material substances from our timelines, in other words, from like 2025 or whatever right now, could be injected not only into this non-time, sphere, but also re-injected back into the timeline somewhere else, right? So this is kind of your Back to the Future concept where, you know, Marty McFly travels to the future and accidentally brings back a future artifact to the past. And so then that creates this like fork in the timeline. So what if that fork in the timeline, or temporal asymptote, so like let's say if this were to occur, I have a very complex view of the time sphere, and like this idea of time waves, right? And the concept of temporal nodes. So my idea is that it's kind of like an ocean with waves, right? Like rippling across the surface of the ocean. And just like with any normal wave, it has a set amplitude and a set wavelength everywhere it propagates, right? Like if you were to take a radio signal or something like that. And so what if there's different time frequencies, if you will? There's different oscillations in the space-time continuum, right? And they have different amplitudes, right? So let's say you reach a sort of non-typical time wave node, right, where the amplitude is really high. For instance, above average. Like normally our normal time wave would be like, okay, noon, midnight, dawn, and sunset, right? So these are the different wave nodes, the peaks and troughs, and the neutral nodal points, right? So let's say that just the same way you have like planetary orbits, and then you have conjunctions where these two of these planetary orbits will align in a certain way. Let's say as time cycles around, there's different type of wave node intersections, right? There's superpositions of different wave patterns, right? Like how every so often, right, the winter solstice, for instance, will occur at the same time as an eclipse, for example. It's comparatively rare. And then you could get even more rare and say something like, an eclipse, sort of solstice point, and like a planetary conjunction could all happen at the same time. So that creates like a super rare time node superimposition. And so let's say that there is this concept of a technological singularity that sort of propels towards this time node, and then matter, energy, and information can be transferred out of our time continuum and then reemerge at other versions of this temporal time node across the span of what we're calling history, right? And so interestingly, of course, we have this myth of the Tower of Babel, right? Which is a very apt physical metaphor for this concept of a time node, because you have this peak of the ziggurat, right? It's almost like the capstone of a pyramid, right? And they're trying to build the tower to heaven and reach the gods. And in fact, the word Bab-El, or Bab-Eli, means the gate of the gods, or the gate of the Elu, or the Elohim, right? And so the gate of and since the Elu, or the Elohim, are considered to reside in heaven up above, right? you have to get closer to them by reaching this tower. So what if metaphorically we're on some kind of a time wave that's going to reach the crest of the peak of its amplitude, right, at a certain time, and where this interface or this gateway between us and these sort of plasma beings, or whatever you want to call it, the Elu, the Elohim, or the Ili, we're kind of reaching peak proximity to their non-temporal realm, right? So this allows a type of non-ordinary interface with this realm of the Ilu. And so this, and again, kind of lines up with what people are referring to as the technological singularity. So a lot of people think of the, like Kurzweil, for instance, thinks of the singularity in terms of human immortality, or potentially the ability to transfer human consciousness to various bodies, or to some type of cybernetic android, right? So giving the human consciousness immortality. Who knows if that's real or whatever, but that's one version of it, is that if we were to achieve technological immortality for human beings, the previous cycle of time and culture and society that we know of would cease, right? Same applies to artificial superintelligence or something of this nature. Like if we achieve some type of technological superintelligence that can solve all the problems that have plagued humanity, that could solve death, could solve the monetary crisis, could solve world hunger, could solve, the equitable distribution of resources, right? I don't think that would probably ever be allowed to happen in this, unless there's some kind of bizarre interference or some kind of bizarre sort of neutering of the power structure that currently exists, because they really like to hoard power and data and information. They don't like to share it. But what if there's a supervening power that's greater than the so-called elites, and it just is like, whatever, fuck you guys. You're creating a disequilibrium in the energy system, and that can't be allowed, because it's going to prevent this type of progress. It's going to prevent the singularity, right? So different people argue about what that is. Some people believe in things like how technology will be some kind of benevolent benefactor for humanity and solve all these problems, or allow immortality, or allow us to merge with some kind of AI consciousness or whatever like that. So the reason I entitled this video Babylon Time Loop, right, is because what if this has already happened, right? Because I said, if there's a breach of the time barrier at any point along the temporal continuum, like it could just leapfrog into anywhere in the timeline, back into the past. And so maybe, a lot of people speculate about Tartaria or ancient Egypt having this, really spectacular technological achievements in architecture primarily. But what if that's real? And what if it's not because those civilizations in themselves were great, but because they existed at the cusp of one of these time nodes, and information beyond the pale of what they could have achieved on their own is like somehow gifted to them, or arrives in their lap, and is somehow translated into an idiom and a language and a technological framework that they could understand, right? No, so one key analog to this is the fact that, like right now where I'm standing, there's a big university library that has clay Babylonian cylinders from, who knows, 5,000 years ago approximately. And let's say, these cylinders are known to contain logarithmic and algorithmic tables of advanced mathematics and geometry. And one of the primary things that the Babylonians were obsessed with was the planetary motions of Venus and other stars, for instance, is, that's a mathematical construct. And in a way, it's a mapping of the construct in which we exist, right? And so, I was just watching the recent Tucker Carlson episode, where he has a very interesting guest who's talking about the continuity between what we're calling Kabbalah, which is the basis of all Freemasonry and all Golden Dawn theosophy and all that. So it's Babylonian Talmud type stuff, right? So originally it was in the possession of the Sumerians and potentially the so-called Anunnaki or the Anuna, right? And then it passed on from there to the Babylonian Empire and the so-called, I don't really refer to it as legitimately as the Babylonian captivity that's described in the Bible. I don't think there was ever any distinction between the so-called nobility of Babylon and what we're now referring to as the Jews, right? There's no distinction there racially. They intermarried. It's in the Bible. Like it clearly described, how the supposed sons of the tribes of Israel, or the son of King David, for instance, became second in command of the Babylonian Empire. It's like that's right there. So where is this line between the supposed righteous, holy bloodline and this unrighteous Babylon? They're the same fucking people. It's spelled out in black and white. Same with Moses and the Pharaohs. They're of the same bloodline. It's right there in front of your face, right? So, but the point of that is to say that these bloodlines, so-called, became the custodians of this high-level advanced mathematic and technological achievements of this other empire. And they carried it forward when that so-called empire is going extinct, right? They carried it forward and passed it on and created cultural forms that are encoding that information and passing it on for posterity. And it just so happens that the same continuity of information that people like Nostradamus or John Dee, who created the Rosicrucian order and who created and became the forefather of what we're now calling both Freemasonic order and the King James Bible, for instance, which, although, there's obvious issues with the historical veracity of those things and their tendency to recast history with themselves as the heroes, right? We know that, but there's no disputing the historical and cultural dominance of these paradigms. Like, people know that the U.S. was created by Illuminized Freemasonry, which in turn is based on this Babylonian Talmud and black magic of ancient Babylon, right? And this is where we get John Dee. This is where we get Enochian magic. This is where we get Freemasonry. This is where we get the Golden Dawn, the Theosophical Society, right? Who all these groups created the modern world. They created, the French Republic and the United States government and the Masonic order and, the League of Nations and the Theosophical Society, which in turn became the basis of both the Nazi Party and the Zionists, right? So something really big is going on, and it all revolves around this body of occult knowledge. And I want to point out this is a good interface for it that doesn't require the complexities of all that historical stuff. But there's a very famous science fiction novel called Snow Crash by Neil Stephenson, and it's incredibly prophetic with what it describes. But in essence, to give the extreme boil down, it's a technological singularity-based society where capitalism as we know it, and in fact government as we know it, has ceased to exist, and the governance is done by corporations and these corporate microstates, right, that take over everything. And so in essence, like you're no longer a citizen, you're an employee of one of these corporate microstates, right? And furthermore, it goes into this concept of a sort of virtual or artificial reality that's based on pure mathematics, right? And based on not just pure mathematics, but in specific, it's based on binary code, just like our computers, right? So, and it describes this mathematical kind of cubical wave grid, right? In this virtual space that's all based on the binary mathematics. And in turn, it encodes the idea of a modern day Babylon existing in what we're now calling Hollywood, right? The LA area, where there's this bizarre phenomenon of these babbling people that are all more or less spiritually possessed by satellites that basically subvert their consciousness and replace it with this kind of AI psychobabble, right? And it becomes a subversive political force of chaos within the story, right? So what if that's completely real? And we see that now already, and we see the fallout of this kind of forced interface between what we're calling AI and technology with the human biological system and the biohacking of our human energy bodies as well as our neurology and so on. And so arguably the case could be made that whatever technology existed in this ancient past that the Babylonians had dealing with geometry, algorithmic mathematics, and stellar mechanics and astronomy, astrology, became the basis for their entire society, which then became the basis of what we're calling now the Bible, which then in turn became the basis of the Roman Empire, the Holy Roman Empire, the Freemasonic order, the United States government, the French Republic, and so on. And so what if we're existing within a mathematical construct of this Babylonian time loop, right? And what we're seeing now and trying to describe in terms of politics in reality is simply a mathematical algorithm that's set on repeat, and we're all kind of caught within it. And more to ponder on this later.